And Darrow said, well, are you talking about 20 days of 24 hours? Bryan said, well, no, they could be understood as metaphorical. I don't know if a day is 24 hours or maybe longer. That was dynamite, and Bryan was not allowed to go back on the witness stand by the prosecution, and the trial was at an end.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation. A new story and book by Brenda Wineapple, telling us the Scopes trial of 1925. It is dramatic. It is sensationally important for the understanding of the culture in the 1920s. It is 100 years later, and it is still debatable. Brenda, congratulations. A very good evening. I take you to Robinson's Drugstore. It is early May 1925, Dayton, Tennessee. There's a meeting there over glass-top tables. You give us these wonderful details, Brenda.
Thank you.
Drinking Coca-Cola with cherry flavor. And they're discussing a law recently passed in January in the legislature in Tennessee, and then again in March by the Senate in Tennessee, becoming a law. And that law is the center of what at the time is joked to be the monkey trials. What is that law? Why is it brought forward by a man named Butler? Good day to you, Brenda.
Oh, good day. Nice to be with you. Thank you so much. Yes, 1925, 100 years ago, and it feels like yesterday in some ways. As you mentioned, the Tennessee legislature passed something that was familiarly known as the Butler Act, because John Washington Butler had proposed it. And what it was, simply put, was a ban on the teaching of evolution in public schools, because the theory of evolution, even though it had been around for a long time, was presumed to deny the story of divine creation as told in the Bible, and instead taught that we're descended from a lower order of animals. And that was the Butler Law, and that's why the Butler Act. And that's why the group that you mentioned, Dayton, Tennessee, Robinson's Drugstore, had gathered together.
Yes, and it's important. All these personalities contribute to what will be a drama in July, but we're beginning in May because there's been an advertisement, small, in Knoxville paper and another,
Right.
asking for someone to come forward who is interested by the ACLU in challenging this law in Tennessee. They're looking for a recruit who will be a sacrifice in a courtroom.
That's absolutely right. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, offered to defend anyone who is willing to test the Butler Act by breaking it. And one local impresario who was working in Dayton decided, got together with a group of people met at Robinson's Drugstore. It was kind of meeting place, and they thought that they should be the ones to break the law. And they asked a young man, a high school teacher, science teacher, substitute teacher, and football coach, if he'd be willing to be the, as you say, sacrificial lamb. His name was John Scopes, and he said, you can't teach evolution, you can't teach science, you can't teach biology without teaching evolution. And he volunteered to be the person who would say he broke the law, and he did, and he was immediately indicted. And that's where the Scopes trial, named for him, began.
It's important to detail about each of these men and their motives, because one of the joys of your book, Brenda, is that this is not good guys versus bad guys.
No.
This is everybody looking out for themselves, necessarily what's in it for me. At the same time, the ACLU and what becomes the prosecutorial staff interested in the literal reading of the Bible, everybody's looking for gains, national publicity. These are early days of radio. These are early days of the newspapers having national reach. Hence, the ACLU knows to advertise in Tennessee where the law has been passed. They don't know who's going to show up. So let us introduce those men at Robinson's Drugstore. George Rappleyea. What do we need to know about him? What is his motive that day, Brenda?
Well, it's really hard to know. He's the local impresario, he's a local entrepreneur. He probably believes that the Butler Act is an offense against science and liberal Christianity. There's many groups, Christian groups, who do not read the Bible literally. The Bible is a work of spiritual and moral sustenance. But at the same time, he's looking to bring a certain kind of notoriety and money to Dayton, where he's living. And so, in that sense, when he sees the newspaper, he immediately gathers a group around because he thinks this would be great for Dayton. He's a kind of town booster as well as anything else.
I note his technology, Brenda. It's a fascination. He has a telephone, which is unusual. He has a call, picks up the
Yeah,
telephone, makes a call to Frank Robinson, and he contacts Walter White. This is the Board of Education.
right. That's right.
And they also have contacts at the University of Tennessee.
That's right.
They have a lot of connections to make, and they bring forward this young man, John T. Scopes. He himself, he's 24 years old. He's just out of the University of Kentucky.
Right.
Father is telling, Claudius, I believe his name is. What do we need to know about his father and the Scopes family of Kentucky?
Well, it's very interesting because his father comes to Dayton to be supportive to his son. His father is a kind of maverick. He was a very clear and prominent socialist and union guy. And so, as a result, he's very proud of his son standing up to the local law, basically. So it's very interesting. And he, of course, in the press is made to be, both John Scopes and his father, made to be heroes as well as iconoclasts and socialists, which at the time is considered to be beyond the pale. So these are unusual people. Now, John Scopes is, as you said, 24 years old, young man, popular around town, popular teacher. He's the one person I think, we don't know what his motives are. The motives seem pretty pure, but what's interesting is he grows older. And the Scopes trial was a notorious trial. It was covered nationally and internationally. And as he grows older, he's offered all kinds of opportunities to have a film made about him, to write a book, things that you would expect today. He turns them all down.
The striking detail in the Robinson's drugstore is that everybody there, including prosecutors and the local justice of the peace that swear out a warrant, the sheriff Swalford who arrests him, everybody knows this is a concocted confrontation. They all
Exactly.
know that even Scopes know that he knows that he won't have to pay for his own defense.
Right.
And he understands that he's going to be in the news. I don't know that at this point they could have imagined how big it is that 100 years later we'd be talking about them drinking their Cokes.
No,
Nobody
I
can
don't think
see
they could
that.
imagine, right?
But it's important to detail here. Scopes is guilty. They all know he's guilty.
Exactly, exactly. That's such a good point. I mean, he is testing the law by breaking it, and of course he's guilty. There's, it's just very clear he broke the law. But the ACLU is coming to town because what they're hoping to do is take this trial ultimately to the Supreme
Right,
Court,
right.
because to them, the issue is the Establishment Clause in the Constitution, which is basically to say there should be, that's stipulated, uh, uh, separation of church and state. And this seems to violate that. So the ACLU knows that Scopes is guilty, but the whole trial is an effort to get, as you said, notoriety, get this law in front of the Supreme Court.
Because this story can tell like a work of genius fiction, I mention foreshadowing here. A man by the name of Bryan is making speeches in Tennessee at the time, and he reads about this indictment in Dayton, and he
Yes.
smiles. And a man named Darrow is in Richmond, Virginia, making speeches as well. And he
Mm,
hears about it quickly and makes a reference to it in an interview, in a newspaper interview, mocking the Tennessee legislature for coming up with such a ridiculous law. We'll leave them there, Darrow and Bryan, because we need to go to New York. And the
mm,
ACLU, also a major player here, looking for a test case. The book is Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation, aka the Scopes Monkey Trial, aka Inherit the Wind with Spencer Tracy. All of that, 100 years later, tells very differently than it did in the mid 20th century or at the time of the trial itself. The ACLU, it has a distinguished history at this point coming through the war. It's
yes.
led by men who are extremely valuable and honored in their world, secretaries of state, justices from the Supreme Court, distinguished Harvard graduates, all of that. They depend on a woman named Lucille Milner, however, to look for test cases that will raise their profile. Lucille Milner sees the item about the Scopes trial. Do they recognize it right away, Brenda, as their kind of talk?
Absolutely, they recognize it. Louise Miller brings the cutting from the newspaper into the head of the ACLU, excuse me, a man named Roger Baldwin, and they both decide immediately to go to the board and propose this is a test case, and it's immediately passed that they will be able to use this if they can get someone to volunteer. And because the ACLU, was founded to protect civil liberties. And to them, this law violates the guarantee of religious liberty. And they want the case, and they are willing to defend it. So this is important for them. The ACLU is only 5 years old at this time. It's not as established as it may be today. And they're looking also to make a name for themselves.
They send for Scopes, Rappleyea, and a man named Neal, who's going to be their defense counsel. He's from the university, John Neal. They
Mhm.
send for them, and the three travel to New York. This is the out-of-towners come to New York City, arriving at the beautiful Pennsylvania station. No longer exists, but
Uh,
I see photographs of it. This glass construction at the same space that right now is being rebuilt into the Pennsylvania station, but
right,
arriving in the big town. And they're spirited by the ACLU in automobiles. Remember, this is early days of everything here.
right.
First, they meet with the committee at ACLU's headquarters, and then they're feted at a luncheon. John Scopes is there, a young man.
Yeah.
And what important details here are the amazing people on the board who are weighing this. Felix Frankfurter is a member of the board.
He is indeed. He is indeed. And the discussion is who should they take on as attorneys? Of course, the ACLU is going to have their own attorney defending Scopes, and that will be a man named Arthur Hayes. But there's also a man whom you mentioned, Clarence Darrow, who's a notorious and celebrated criminal and labor lawyer who has volunteered himself to defend Scopes pro bono without any fee at all because he felt that this Butler Act is filled with bigotry and fanatics. And since it's being defended by another man whom you mentioned, William Jennings Bryan, Darrow feels called to battle. So part of the meeting that you're talking about in the ACLU offices downtown Manhattan have to do with who shall defend John Scopes.
And
John,
it's a spirited conversation, Brenda. That's what also is exciting. This isn't like, oh, well, it's obvious Darrow, he's going to be famous in 100 years. Darrow has Darrow has enemies. Is that too strong a word? People who doubt him?
I wouldn't say they're enemies, but he has a spotted reputation. For
Yes.
example, just the year before, 1924, he defended the two young men, basically teenagers, Leopold and Loeb, who killed a third boy, teenager, for no reason. And they admitted that they did it. It was a cold-blooded, cruel, heinous crime. That they were tried in court and in the papers. Everyone knew they were guilty. They killed this poor boy, Bobby Franks, for the fun of it, for the thrill of it, and they thought that they could get away with it. And Clarence Darrow was their defense attorney, not because he thought they were innocent, they weren't, but because he hated capital punishment and he did not want them put to death. And he won. So he was notorious. He was in the papers. He was beloved by many people, but at the same time, he was thought of as being too much of a showman and celebrity, and the ACLU was a little nervous about his ties to perhaps socialism, progressivism, and to the newspapers. So they were a little shy of him.
All accurate, Brenda. Their anxiety was well taken, because what we're looking at is a man who is famous, really famous, and there were other choices. Charles Evans Hughes, candidate for the presidency in 1916, Supreme Court Justice.
Right.
John Davies, having just campaigned not successfully for the presidency. They
Uh,
wanted, they wanted constitutional law.
exactly, because eventually, as I said, they wanted to get this law before the Supreme Court where it could be annulled. But in fact, Scopes stood up finally at this meeting. It wasn't quite contentious, but it was very excited. And Scopes stood up and he basically said, "Look, this is I want a street fighter." And Clarence Darrow is a street fighter. And since he is the person who's going to be on trial after all, the ACLU is defending him, but he is the one who is at the center of this storm. They had to listen to what he wanted. And so,
Let's let's meet Clarence Darrow, because this is also a
mm,
drama that's not believable here 100 years later. The book is Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation. Brenda Wineapple is the author. The Tennessee law is going to be very much represented not only by its own prosecutors, local in Dayton, Tennessee, and also men who are interested from the state capitol, but a man named Bryan, William Jennings Bryan, who is as famous in 1925 as you can be, given him coming out of having run for the presidency 3 times and been Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. What we're looking at here, Secretary of State, what we're looking at here is names that everybody knew right away. Why did they know Clarence Darrow? Who is he? Where did he come from? The man is skillful in courtroom drama. He's extremely well spoken. Right away, we have to start with how he got to have such a reputation in the courtroom. He goes to Chicago from small town America, and he meets up with a man named Altgeld, who becomes his mentor. Who is Altgeld, Brenda?
John Altgeld, I think he would be better known today had he not died early on. He was a very outspoken, socialist leaning, shall we say, progressive, who was governor in Illinois. I mean, he was a big figure in Chicago. He had made a lot of money investing in real estate. He later lost all of that money. And when young Darrow came to Chicago from small town in Ohio. He and Altgeld became very, very good friends, and Altgeld really got Darrow on his way. But Altgeld was a person who really felt that, for example, poverty was the cause of crime, not that people were necessary, not that they were at all bad people, but the conditions, social conditions that surround people cause crime, and that was poverty. And Darrow learned a great deal from Altgeld. Altgeld was also instrumental in pardoning the remaining people who had been accused of the Haymarket bombing in the 1890s. So and everyone assumed they were guilty. They were supposed to be anarchists. But Altgeld studied the trial. Darrow wanted him to, and realized that the judge was himself too hasty in sending these people to prison or execution in that particular sense. So Altgeld was really out there. Teddy Roosevelt, for example, and others just felt that he was too radical for the United States, especially in the, as I said, 1880s and 1890s. So Darrow learned a great deal from him, and Darrow's career was launched at this particular time. Darrow was interesting because he was both a corporation lawyer, but at the same time, and making good money, but at the same time willing to take on the case of socialists. He was willing to take on union organizers. He was willing later to take on pacifists. He was willing to take on bomb throwers as their defense attorney because he felt that everyone deserves a good defense. He was an early founder of the NAACP. He defended the rights of Blacks and other minorities. He hated the pogroms in Russia, and he was a big reader of Whitman, Nietzsche, and Haussmann.
Let's go through some of the cases that Darrow took up. He comes from small town, Ohio, Farmdale. His father and mother were abolitionists, so he had early understanding of how to challenge the state. However, the cases define him. Brenda's mentioned the Haymarket riot and the pardoning of the ones who were still alive by the governor. Darrow was then appointed to an important position, an attorney's position in Chicago, in the mayor's office of Chicago. He leaves that to take up Eugene V. Debs, who was chairman of the American Railway Union. Darrow becomes right away a pro-union man, which is understood in 1898 and afterwards as radical, right? That would have been before there was a Soviet Union. There were these unions.
That's right. It was a very important and powerful time for unions. In fact, Theodore Dreiser and others wrote about unions, and unions were organized around protest against what we know today as the robber barons, the plutocrats, the monopolists who were exploiting they felt workers. And in many cases, their tactics were violence. And Darrow was their attorney. As I said, while he's making money in other domains like corporations, he's also fighting corporations. And he took on Eugene Debs, a socialist and later candidate for president, because he thought Debs was innocent, that the powers that be, that the government was concocting conspiracy indictments in order to just quell this rebellious spirit of the unions.
He takes on the Amalgamated Wood Association, Thomas Kidd. The one that I'm keen on is the anthracite coal strike of 1902 because Teddy Roosevelt got involved.
He did get involved.
Darrow weighs in, a man who might be as famous as Darrow at the time. Oh, Darrow was more famous than Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was his accidency. He inherited the presidency. So
he made the most out of it.
Anthracite coal was a bane of that administration. This is Teddy Roosevelt's first term, Theodore, the colonel. In wades Darrow, and Darrow was brilliant at the summaries to juries. That's what he could do. And he would transform the accused into a victim. And to your understanding, Brenda, did he invent this style or was it always there and he was imitating somebody older?
My sense is that he was gifted in the art of talking to juries, that he really is the creator of a certain down home style where he puts his thumbs in his suspenders. He is able to speak in a non-academic, non-abstract, non-abstruse language. He doesn't use legalisms. He talks directly, looks directly at the jury. There's people feel that there's a kindness and a humanity in what he's able to do. And he's also a gifted orator. In many ways, he's a frustrated novelist and poet who found his métier, who found his voice in front of a jury because he was also a gifted performer and actor. So he had these uh, many qualities that spoke to the heart of people sitting in in the jury box, where he felt that he's talking to each one individually. He's not talking down to them, he's talking directly to them. And that's what made him enormously successful. And he was able to take on these cases where people knew that the defendants were actually guilty, and they were guilty of terrible crimes, not John Scopes, who just taught a class in biology, but these were murderers, these were anarchists, these were people who were, they were fighting against the status quo.
He took Big Bill Haywood, for heaven's sakes, in 1907 and invented the term the vultures of Wall Street. Boy, did the press love him. He was great copy. Now, that style of his runs into a wall. The Los Angeles Times built a bombing, and a couple of brothers named McNamara. What happened, Brenda?
What happened there is that these brothers weren't even in town when this terrible bombing took place of the Los Angeles Times building. It was an awful situation. People were killed. And these two brothers who had been part of the union, they were held guilty for having one presumably planted the bomb, but the other was also guilty of having conspired to put this terrible plan in motion. And what happened was Darrow took on the defense of the McNamara brothers, but since he was a celebrity, since he was outside the norm, since he was considered to be as bad as the union organizers because he could defend them so easily and get them off. He himself, Darrow, was indicted for bribing a juror.
It may or may not have been true, Brenda. There's no resolution of this. It's more than 100 years now. So we just mentioned that that was the beginning of a bad patch for Clarence Darrow. And
very bad patch, right? He was put on trial twice. Once a hung jury, and even today, as you suggest, we don't know if he did this or not, because he was a crafty man, but at the same time, would he stoop to bribing a juror, or was this the LA Attorney General out to get Darrow and get him out of town?
Darrow is in the courtroom in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. The other side of the courtroom is held by a man named William Jennings Bryan. That's where we're going. The boy orator of the Platte River. Brenda Wineapple is the author. The book is Keeping the Faith. It's the story of the Scopes trial of 1925, but also it's the story of America in transition from the 19th century to the technology and the tragedy of the 20th century. In 1925, when they gather in Dayton, Tennessee for a trial of a young man who's volunteered, knowing everybody knows he's guilty of doing what they know to be a law that very likely is unconstitutional. The law passed by the Tennessee legislature and Senate. They were all gathered there knowing that these men are larger than anything that could be resolved in this trial. One side is Darrow. We've talked a little bit about how famous he is. Now, William Jennings Bryan, the boy orator of the Platte River, coming out of Nebraska. He served as a member of Congress. And then in 1896, he
Mm.
took the stage at the Chicago Convention for the Democratic Party. And they were looking for a nominee to run against William McKinley, who was the Republican nominee. And he took the stage and made a speech that still echoes. What was the Cross of Gold speech to Bryan? Why did he do that?
William Jennings Bryan, a young man, came to Chicago for the Democratic National Convention in 1896, and he riveted the people there. He got up on the platform and he gave, as you mentioned, what was called the Cross of Gold speech. And it was considered then and later one of the best examples of political oratory in the country. And what he basically said was that we will not be crucified on a cross of gold. The cross of gold is represented represented to him the plutocrats, the fat cats, the monopolists, the robber barons that were bleeding the country dry. 1896, there was a recession, and Bryan stood up to speak for the farmers, the men and women of the plains, the people whom he felt had been forgotten. And he became their champion. And this young man, this boy orator, who, as he was called, was then the nominee at the Democratic Convention, and he went on to run for president. Nobody really had heard of him before, and here he was, the holding the banner high for a new kind of Democratic party.
Note detail. Brenda's good about giving us the family. Now, note detail here is his father, Silas, is a copperhead from Salem, Illinois. And that's a way of saying a man from the North, Illinois, Lincoln State, siding with the Confederacy and speaking for Jefferson Davis. So early in life, Bryan was in two worlds, Brenda.
Yes, he was in two worlds, but the kind of populist that he was, and in a way that his father was a sense that they were speaking for the people, the so-called people. And in that particular way, the Copperhead, the Silas Bryan, who was enormously influential on his son's life, felt that you should be able to, as a member of a state, Illinois, which Illinois is a complicated state, even though, as you say, Lincoln's from it, but he's also Stephen Douglas is from Illinois, and Silas Bryan was behind Douglas, which was to say popular sovereignty. If we want to vote to keep slavery, then we should be able to vote to keep slavery. How dare the federal government, the Republicans, the Lincoln Party, come in and tell us what to do? So Bryan comes from a tradition where the people should decide. He was a great believer in democracy. And in that way, we consider him a progressive. He was a man who did stand for women having the vote, for people, citizens being able to vote for their representatives as opposed to having them chosen by the legislature, which in the case of the Senate had been the way senators had been chosen. So it's a very interesting background to Bryan, and in a sense, he was the best and the worst of a kind of democratic energy.
He runs for president again in 1900 and is again defeated by McKinley. He does not run in 04 against Teddy Roosevelt, but he does run in 08, three times nominee of the Democratic Party. But between 1908 and 1925, he's making a transformation of himself. He serves in the Wilson cabinet as Secretary of State and resigns because they call him a pacifist and a coward. They call him all kinds of things. He's against the war. He's against the U.S. getting involved in the war. And 100 years later, Brenda, he has a very good case, but we'll leave that aside right now and say that he fell out of favor with his own Democratic Party. So when he reads about He's speaking in Tennessee, as I mentioned before. You've given us that detail. When he reads about the Scopes trial, he
Mhm.
has ambitions to recover. How? How did he think the Scopes trial would help him?
Well, first of all, he was a Midwesterner. He had moved to Florida. This is 1924, 1925. He'd already been in Florida, and he was positioning himself to run for Senate in Florida. He wanted to get back into government. He'd been making quite a bit of money in real estate, and he'd been currying favor with the Southern Democrats. And it's very possible, I think it's very likely, that he was even toying with the idea of becoming the presidential nominee in 1928. At the same time, he had become more rigid in some of his views. He was an adamant prohibitionist, and he was a religious fundamentalist, which means that he read the Bible literally. And so when the fundamentalist organization heard about the Scopes trial in the ACLU, they asked Bryan to prosecute uh, Scopes, and he was more than willing because, of course, he knew that this would keep him on the front pages. And at the same time, he really believed that we should read the Bible literally and that we should be mandated to do so, and that in fact, evolution, the theory of evolution in Darwin, was depriving children and students of any kind of moral center. So he was excited to get to Dayton.
Yeah, he had a plan, and the first thing he was going to do is say evolution denies miracles of creation right away. And everybody would nod and go, "You're right, it does. Exactly. We don't want that in our town."
No.
The book is Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation, Brenda Wineapple. This is the Scopes Monkey Trial of 1925. We are now at the time that the principals, William Jennings Bryan, many times presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, Secretary of State, famous now for advancing the literal reading of the Bible, the fundamentalists, what many times will be translated into evangelicals in the 21st century. However, this is literal reading of the Bible. If it says that God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the seventh, they mean days. They don't mean like days, they mean days. However, the opponent at this trial will be Clarence Darrow, who is the most famous courtroom drama trial lawyer of the time, a man who's known as taking on impossible cases and finding a good outcome for the defendant. They're arriving in a town that is part of the drama. It's a stage set, it's an opera, Dayton, Tennessee. Brenda tells us there are three hotels, two of them are closed. There's one Jewish family, there are three Roman Catholic families. It's dominated by Protestant fundamental America. And the Aqua Hotel is where you go when you come into town. We need to meet the judge, John T. Raulston, 56 years old. What do we need to know about him, Brenda? Thank you.
Thanks. John Raulston was himself a fundamentalist. He found himself in the middle of this celebrated trial where journalists from all over the country are coming into Dayton. He's very excited by it. He was even willing to hold a trial in a football stadium. So he loves celebrity. He loves having his picture taken. But at the same time, he's trying to be very, very fair when he's presiding over these larger than life figures who've come to town, who he's very excited to meet. He's admired Bryan, for example, for many years, and like Bryan, he believes in the Bible, that the Bible should be read literally, but he at the same time wants to welcome the outsiders, as they were called, that have come representing Scopes and the ACLU. So he's trying to be fair. He has a very difficult job. He comes into the courthouse every day carrying not just a dictionary, but a Bible under his arm.
He takes the trial up knowing he's also running for re-election. I like motives, Brenda, when we can find them. and a politician's always running for re-election. And,
Exactly.
and so, and I'm struck here because this is the reporting that Brenda does is very convincing.
Mm.
John Raulston is fair-minded, and
Yes,
he's criticized afterwards for being too lax about his rulings in court. He balanced as much as he could on the basis of the national stage that he was sitting on. I think he did a strangely excellent job of staying out of the contest when Darrow and Bryan met. However, there's some details here. Brenda has wonderful details. First of all, they repaint the courthouse. They have room for maybe 1,000 people, but they also put up loudspeakers outside so the whole region can come and listen. And the Chicago Tribune, is that right? Chicago Tribune puts it on the radio.
exactly. I mean, this was a trial considered a trial of the century, and what that meant is that people were hanging on the words of Bryan, Darrow, and everything that was going on in Dayton, so that the technology of the early 20th century also played a role in making this trial very well known, and in some sense, from one point of view, and certainly from the point of view of the defense, um, a way to educate the public as to what the theory of evolution was all about, even though people had come to accept it, because after all, Darwin had written in the middle and late 19th century, and we're in a new century, which is considered modern and in its own way hip. So everything is converging on this little town. This little town, by the way, only had a population of 2,000. It's a very, very small, hospitable town.
Everybody's also commenting, but a detail here. Remember, the ACLU saw this as a constitutional case. That's why they were reluctant to give it to Darrow, because they thought that might prevent them getting there. They were right in an unusual fashion. So right away, the constitutional lawyers leave the case, and we need to introduce a man who then stands in for the constitutional lawyers, a man who looks to me to be the undiscovered hero here, Arthur Garfield Hayes. What do we need to know about him, Brenda? He's on
Arthur,
the
yeah,
defense counsel.
yes, and he works for the ACLU as volunteers. He's a lawyer from Manhattan and New York City. He's named for three presidents: Chester Arthur, James Garfield, Rutherford Hayes. He is a secular Jewish man, which means he's identified as Jewish, but he's not observant. It's very interesting because the major people on the defense represent a kind of spectrum of religious points of view. Just to take an aside for a minute, Darrow is an acknowledged agnostic. One of the men on the trial, Dudley Malone, is a practicing Catholic. And then you have this Arthur Garfield Hayes, who goes on to have a very, I think, important and illustrative career in the ACLU, um, fighting for civil liberties. And at one point, he even goes to Germany to defend the men who theoretically started the Reichstag fire. I should also say that he wasn't allowed to say much because he was in Germany in the 1930s and he was Jewish, as Hitler well knew. But that's in the future. Right now, he is what we would call today a workaholic. He's a serious man, and he is, in a way, the ballast in this courtroom drama. He speaks, but he doesn't have the eloquence of a Dudley Malone or the down home Cracker Barrel style of Clarence Darrow.
How famous is this moment? George Bernard Shaw has an opinion. H.G. Wells says, no, they didn't invite me. That's how famous this is. So Darrow comes to town momentarily earlier on and then goes off to make speaking engagements and back to Chicago. It's the arrival of Bryan that's most exciting because Brenda has wonderful pictures throughout her book. And there's a picture I'd never seen before, Brenda, of Bryan stepping off the Palmetto Special wearing his pith helmet.
I
I
love
thought this is a completely different personality than Hollywood wanted me to see. This is This is a character out of what? What is he, an opera star? What is he at the time, Brenda? How does he think of himself?
He thinks of himself as a leader in the Democratic Party. He thinks of himself as the great commoner, as one of his nicknames. He thinks of himself as a man of the people, and he thinks of himself as, in a way, a movie star. With the pith helmet, which, by the way, is presumably blocks the sun, keeps him cool. But I mean, he's there with a pith helmet, and he is waving a big fan in the shape of a palm leaf because it's so hot. This is July in Tennessee, and it happens to be a heat wave, and nobody has any air conditioning. And he gets off the train and he's surrounded by well wishers. I mean, he is one of the most famous political figures of the day. I mean, as you said, he ran for president 3 times. He was Wilson's Secretary of State. He's been campaigning, he campaigned for prohibition, and now he is here to save the world from atheism.
An important detail in Brenda's story. She recognizes, and it's convincing, that Bryan and Darrow are very close. There's not much separation. How so, Brenda? What makes them the same person at this moment?
Well, first of all, they both love an audience. First and second of all, they both love, because they love the audience, they love to speak. Third of all, they really believe in what they're doing. And in the fourth place, they both started in the same place. And Darrow, early on, 1896, actually campaigned for Bryan. So these two men have known each other for a long time, but their paths diverged enormously because, as we know, Darrow became this famous criminal attorney taking on cases that Bryan would never touch. But at the same time, they hated some of the popular theories of the day, like eugenics, which was a form of social engineering that they found to be repulsive. That they both were opponents of the kind of social inequity and class system and caste system in the country. So they had many of the same values, but Bryan felt that people should have a moral center, and even if we have to make laws to make them behave, whereas Darrow comes to the courtroom wearing a little pin that says LLL, and when he's asked what it means, he says, live and let live.
The evening of Bryan's arrival, or the next night, I'm not sure. This is early July, and heat wave that's striking Tennessee, and to a point that it becomes a character in the drama. It's so hot. He goes to dinner to speak to the Progressive Club of Dayton, club speech, and he's sitting at dinner with John Scopes, the 24-year-old. And Brenda has this wonderful scene. You always want to know, what do they have for lunch? Okay, this is a dinner. And I take it that there's some meat dish, but left over on John Scopes' plate. This is an athlete, man who coaches football, plays tennis, 24 years old. He leaves the potatoes and corn on the plate, I imagine smeared with lard, because that's how they cook in the Midwest. And Darrow leans across, and Bryan leans across, and Brenda's reporting says, if you're not going to finish that, I will. And John goes, yes, fine. And Bryan heaps the potatoes and corn on his plate and then pours sugar into his iced tea. And Brenda, at that point, I thought, you can't make this stuff up. Why is this all alarming to anybody who knows what's going on?
Well, John Scopes takes a look at those potatoes, corn, and that sugar in the tea, and he says to himself, this is a man who can't know anything about science, because because John Scopes knows that Bryan is suffering from diabetes, and here he is piling sugar, starch onto his plate and in his tea. So Scopes is laughing to himself, because here he's a biology teacher, and in Bryan is presuming to know something about science when he knows absolutely nothing about it. So it was a very telling situation at that Progressive Club dinner.
Right now, we're going to turn momentarily to what happens next, which is the trial begins in the heat wave. Brenda Wineapple, the book is Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation. The principals have gathered. The trial begins, but there are surprises right away because the defense wants to enter into the record, the science that they're saying is accurate and well taken, and declaring it unacceptable, a crime to convey that science to school children is outrageous. However, the court rules, eventually the prosecution rules, that they can't bring any of their scientists in, uh, meaning that the whole defense plan is awry right away. Do I read that correctly, Brenda? They were thrown off balance.
Well, yes, they were, but what they were able to do, even though the number of scientists who had come to Dayton in order to testify, and they were religious men, by the way, since they weren't allowed to get on the stand, what the defense team was able to do, and Arthur Hayes was the leader of this, was read their affidavits into the record. That meant that the jury itself didn't hear the scientific testimony about evolution and what it meant, but the court record would have that information and it would be disseminated in the newspapers. So it was a setback and in some ways for the defense an outrage, but at the same time, the defense was very cagey and got it into the record. But as I said, the jury didn't hear this at all.
Yes, now that's a blow to the defense. At the same time, Brenda introduces us to a very famous man, H.L. Mencken, writing for the American Mercury, who's in town observing this affair as well as the surrounding area. Mencken is a card. He writes extremely well. For example, he says, I paraphrase from Brenda's reporting, any man who doubts around here might as well be accused of being a cannibal because this is a world of certainty. And Mencken sees that the defense is set back. Is he sympathetic to Darrow? I couldn't tell, Brenda.
I think he is very sympathetic to Darrow because, like Darrow, he considers William Jennings Bryan a fanatic and a bigot who would impose his from Mencken and Darrow's point of view, his rigid, unthinking, anti-intellectual point of view on the nation, and he finds that to be absolutely reprehensible. So he is friendly with Darrow, and he's actually published Darrow in the American Mercury. And Mencken, as you said, he's an unusual figure. At the time, he was enormously influential. Ernest Hemingway, for example, wrote in The Sun Also Rises, the novel, that young men all get their ideas from H.L. Mencken. So he was a very popular man, and he was very acerbic, very funny, as you said, great writer. And he's the one who called this area of the country the Bible Belt, and he's the one that really gave the trial the shorthand name of the monkey trial.
The book is Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation. Brenda Wineapple is the author. Heartily recommend the drama, but we're going to go to the seventh day. How do these things happen? On the seventh day, God rested. On the seventh day, Jennings testified. Not inside. The judge, Judge Raulston, trying to be extremely fair-minded, was also aware that the floor was sagging. There were so many people inside the courtroom. And so wisely, the jury was begging to share his electric fan. There weren't enough fans in the courthouse for the heat wave wafting over people. All the men took their coats off, so there are photographs of Bryan and Jennings and Darrow and Malone and Hayes, all without their lawyerly jackets. However, they move outside. The judge has a good idea. So the loudspeakers, the radio broadcast, there are photographs of this. You can see the faces contorted with the heat that's pouring off of them. At the same time, Darrow has a genius idea. And Brenda reports it walking one night back to where they've been staying in town. And what is that idea, Brenda?
That idea is a shocking legal maneuver that may or may not be legitimate, but it certainly was at the trial. Since Bryan had said he was an expert on the Bible, Darrow and Hayes decided to put William Jennings Bryan on the witness stand and interrogate him. Very unusual for a defense lawyer to put the prosecution lawyer on the stand. It was shocking, but Judge Raulston went along with it because he, who was very enamored of Bryan, wanted to hear what this three-time presidential candidate and important figure had to say. The prosecution team who worked with Bryan were horrified. They did not want him on the stand, but Bryan was excited and he was willing to go on the stand because he thought this would give him an opportunity, a forum to tell the world his ideas. So he, in the middle of this July heat wave, blisteringly hot, gets on the makeshift wooden stand outside in front of the courtroom while boys are selling soda pop, and Darrow goes after him.
Yes, now, this is Darrow at his genius, but at the same time, Bryan is prideful, and he takes the challenge. He believes he can defeat Darrow because they had a prior on this. In 1923, wonderful little detail, Bryan writes an item, I believe, for the local newspaper, the Chicago newspaper, and Darrow writes back. Remind me how it works, Brenda.
How it works is that Bryan is this very well known now fundamentalist reading the Bible literally, and Darrow puts in the paper a series of questions for Bryan to answer, and these will be very similar to the questions that Darrow is going to ask Bryan on the stand. Do you believe really that Jonah made the suns to stand still? I mean, Joshua, do you believe that Jonah was eaten by the whale? Where did Cain get his wife? There are lots of questions, and Bryan, of course, not of course, but Bryan won't deign to answer because he figures and he says, oh, why should I bother with an atheist like Darrow? Which, by the way, is a misunderstanding. Darrow's not an atheist. He's an agnostic. He says the beginning of wisdom is not to know. So he says, I don't know. I have no idea if there's a God or if there may very well be. So in any event, the rehearsal was several years before, and here they are again in the hot July sun, ready to go at one another. Bryan thinking he has the opportunity to broadcast his ideas, and Darrow is really excited about humiliating Bryan, which is actually what he does because Bryan can't answer his questions.
Yes, the question that seems to be the most important for Darrow to get to is God created all of this in 6 days and on the seventh day rested. And Darrow takes an opportunity when Bryan makes a mistake. I don't want to presume it was a mistake. I'm going to say it's easy enough to read all of this as not literal, but metaphorical, which is how the Bible often writes. It's poetic language translated many times. And the defense has made the point, there's not just one reading of the Bible. Look at all these examples. There's the King James Bible. There's the Hebrew Bible. There's the original text that we have from the Pentateuch. There are all these translations. And yet the literal reading of the Bible in English is what Bryan says he's defending, except he makes a mistake. Explain how the mistake works, Brenda, about the creation.
the mistake. And Bryan, it may not have been a mistake. He may have been speaking the truth, but the truth is a violation of what he was there to defend. He was there to defend the literal reading of the Bible. So, as you say, the world was created in 6 days, and on the seventh by God, and the seventh God rested. And when Darrow said, "Well, are you talking about 20 days of 24 hours?" Bryan said, "Well, no, they could be understood as metaphorical. I don't know if a day is 24 hours or maybe longer." And that was dynamite for the defense, because suddenly Bryan was undermining his own position, and his position was this one and only Bible has to be read literally, and suddenly he's doing exactly what the defense said how the Bible should be read, which is, of course, metaphoric. And he realized his mistake, and the prosecution realized his mistake, and at that point, the persecution, the interrogation of Bryan was over, and the next day everybody went inside, and Bryan was not allowed to go back on the witness stand by the prosecution, and the trial was at an end.
Yes, there is a twist here. Bryan is counting on having a closing statement, and that is foregone because of the way the trial ended and the jury declared Scopes guilty, and there's no closing statement whatsoever. So he doesn't get to make that speech. He has it published, though, the speech he would have made, and that is some satisfaction to him. I want to make sure that I've made the correct connections. Darrow was pushing him to explain creation. And oftentimes he would say, how long have we been here? And there's a calculation at the time of something like 4,000 years. There's another calculation, something like 6,000 years. But Darrow's dealing with evolution. And so he's also dealing with geology. And all of that is said millions of years. They don't have anywhere near the comprehensive understanding of the Earth and the solar system that we have today. You got to push that aside, your learning, and understand that there was, in the literal reading of the Bible, for all but the last 200 years, that creation was really 7 days. That was popular in Europe before our ancestors came to America. So Darrow is pushing into territory that is substantively consistent with evolution. Did I read that correctly, Brenda?
Absolutely, because he knows geology, and he knows that he knows geology, he knows archaeology, he knows the fact that there's biology at this particular time. He knows that that the scientists have discovered that the Earth has taken a very long time to form. What about the dinosaurs, for example? You can't limit the age of the Earth into 5,000 years. Moreover, what Darrow also does is ask Bryan about other religious texts. What about the Quran? He said. Bryan says he's not interested in other religious texts. He's not interested in other Bibles. He's not interested in other peoples. He says he does not think about it. What about Buddhism? He said, well, he finds that Buddhism and other religions are inferior to Christianity. So much of what he says not only flies in the face of geology, but flies in the face of world religions. And people who are reading about this after the fact are shocked, because this testimony goes into the newspapers and is widely published and disseminated.
A surprise ending coming back. Brenda Wineapple is the author. Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation. The trial ends on the 21st, and on the 26th, Mary Bryan, his wife, who's arthritic and in a wheelchair, sends one of their aides to wake Bryan, who's taking a nap after a midday meal. And Brenda, this is a very sad turn. I know in Inherit the Wind, it was not filled in. You just were led to understand that Bryan dies soon afterwards. However, there is the suggestion in your reporting that with his death, and he died, they believe, of a stroke, but that diabetes clue you provide was an indication that he'd not been properly caring for himself for some time. There is a suggestion that Darrow's triumph became a way of speaking against him. Was that popular to say that Darrow had driven Bryan into his grave?
If you're a Bryan supporter, or you're horrified by the humiliation that Darrow inflicted on Bryan, you're likely to say that Darrow caused Bryan's death. But I think there are more physiological reasons. For one thing, as you mentioned, it was brutally hot, and Bryan was on the witness stand outdoors in the July heat. Second of all, as we saw, he piled potatoes and corn onto his plate. He was a diabetic, and his diabetes was probably not in control, not just because of what he ate, but because he was always hungry. He actually looked very thin. So the combination of the heat, the stress, the diabetes contributed, I think, to his death. And his death, it's just so uncanny that it would occur, but he never left Dayton. He was able to get to Chattanooga and to get his rebuttal into the papers, but he never saw it when it was published because he died in Dayton, which is a kind of shock, although H.L. Mencken, as usual, had his acerbic comment about this. He said that God took out his bow and arrow, aimed at Darrow, missed, and got Bryan instead.
Whatever happened to, we've mentioned some of the trials. Brenda talked about the Leopold and Loeb trial. Afterwards, Darrow takes on one trial too many in the 1930s with Dudley Malone. And it very much, again, introduces the possibility that Darrow didn't have a good governor on how he saw himself. He takes on a trial, a murder trial, a lynching trial in Hawaii, where the suspects are clearly understood to be guilty. They're even boasting about it. It's the murder of a young Hawaiian man who's accused of rape of a principal's wife. However, there's doubts about the way it was handled, and there's also doubts about the influence peddling afterwards. If I understand correctly, Hoover got involved as well as the governor. Is that right, Brenda?
It's alleged that Hoover got involved. What happened was because this young Hawaiian man was accused of murder and it was probably set up, it became a racially charged trial. And Darrow took the defense of the men who were clearly guilty, which shocked many of Darrow's Black friends and people in the NAACP because it seemed so unlike him. If Hoover and definitely Malone got involved, they got involved in ways that are chilling. They said, let's bring the trial to the mainland, meaning the United States mainland, as opposed to Hawaii, which wasn't a state yet, and that seemed also racially charged. So here Darrow is taking on this case that seems to fly in the face of all of his values, his backing of Black men and women. Just after the Scopes trial, he defended a family that had defended itself in self-defense against a white mob, white supremacist mob in Detroit that wanted this family out of the neighborhood. So the Hawaiian trial seemed outrageous. But at the same time, Darrow, this was in the 30s by this time, Darrow had lost a lot of money in the 29 crash, and he might have been there just for the money. Again, that tells you what a complicated character Clarence Darrow was.
Following some of the other personalities you introduce us to, I've told you I have a prejudice for Hayes, and we've mentioned how he was at the Rice trial. For heaven's sakes, Hayes is a brave man. Dudley Malone, whatever happened to?
Dudley Malone is a fascinating figure. He had actually worked in Wilson's administration as well, and he himself, even before Bryan did, quit his job, resigned in protest against Wilson's handling of women suffrage activists who had been picketing outside of the White House. So here, Darrow was a proto-feminist. He seemed to be. He was himself. He ran in New York City on basically socialist-leaning tickets. But as the 20s turned into what we call the Jazz Age and the Roaring 20s, he became a very well-known divorce lawyer. But he lived a high life. He spent a lot of money. Himself got divorced, even though he was a Catholic.
Several times divorced.
Several times. And he was bankrupt, actually, and he wound up in California, in LA, working on the edges of the movie industry, and then actually starring in a film where he plays Winston Churchill, whom by the end of his life, he looked a little bit like. There's nothing like Winston Churchill. So his is a really very, to my mind, sad story of someone who was so gifted, so eloquent, so outspoken, so dapper, who then becomes, in a way, a victim of his own success and of the times.
We mentioned John Scopes before, never writing his autobiography. He became a geologist, I believe. They sent him to geology school in Chicago.
Yeah, he went to graduate school in the University of Chicago because the group of scientists, part of some of whom who come to testify, a group of scientists, put together a fund so that he could continue his studies. He left teaching at this time. Then when he finished his studies in the University of Chicago, he worked for various oil companies, got married, very, very rarely spoke about the Scopes trial, refused to exploit it, never went into the movies. As I said before, he was asked to, never wrote a tell-all, wrote an autobiography, a memoir later in his life, but it's subdued. So he lived a very, in a way, reclusive life.
And Darrow dies in 1938 of heart.
Yes.
And the movie Inherit the Wind is made in 1960, which is a 20th century version of this story. Brenda's told the 21st century version of this story. Everybody was in it for worthy motives of their mission. The ACLU, Dayton, the Tennessee legislature, certainly John Scopes, certainly Clarence Darrow, certainly William Jennings Bryan. I don't find anyone here suffering except for the unnamed, the people who were at the edges of society at the time, and Darrow was seeking to improve their lot, and Bryan was seeking to be the cultural judge of 1925 America. I recommend the book highly because it's 100 years now, and how little we've changed and how much we've changed. Keeping the Faith, Brenda Wineapple. I'm John Batchelor.